starting point, I suppose, is that in 2024, a committee of the Irish Parliament voted in favor of a report which recommended the legalization of what is called assisted dying, which is of course a euphemism for something else. What's happening in Ireland cannot be understood in isolation, right? This is part of a worldwide movement by highly effective and very well-resourced lobbyists who are pushing in favor of the legalization of assisted suicide or euthanasia worldwide. And what's happening in Ireland really forms a part of that. So I think the international experience would be is of very great relevance in understanding what's likely to happen in Ireland in the next few years as the activists really get into high gear, and what is likely to happen if by misfortune the Irish Parliament were to vote in favor of such a law. We are really nearing a tipping point in the West. This is a map of the jurisdictions which have so far legalized assisted suicide / euthanasia, right? In deep blue, we're talking, is euthanasia, and in sort of, light blue are, the jurisdictions which are legalized assisted suicide. So we can really see Canada, Australia, New Zealand, some American states. Surprisingly, sometimes it's actually not being very, successful as a cause in America for, I think, cultural reasons, essentially. But in Europe, of course, it's been very successful. Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain and Portugal, but recently, very worryingly, even Germany, which of course has traditionally had a ruling class, a class of politicians and lawyers who have been very skeptical about such moves for very obvious historical reasons. But but euthanasia, assisted suicide, is now legal in Germany as well. And of course, there is what's happening east of Ireland in the United Kingdom. There are currently bills pending in England and Wales, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands. The ones in the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands have already been passed. The one in England has passed the second reading, and the one in Scotland is also is also at the same stage. So, and in France, of course, President Macron has signaled his intention to force the French Parliament to legalize euthanasia of some sort. So really, it's really coming across the West, and we're really at the tipping point where it is on the cusp of becoming the default for Western countries. And once it becomes the cultural default in the West, it tends to spread everywhere else, as tends to be the case with social changes of this sort. Legalization has taken many different paths. In places like Oregon, the Netherlands, and Belgium, it has been done through primarily legislative means. The local legislature voted in favor of a law to legalize it. In other jurisdictions, the courts have been at the forefront of legalization. In Canada, it was the Supreme Court of Canada which declared that to ban assisting suicide was a violation of the right to life, which is a very perverse sort of logic. In Italy, same thing, and in Germany, in 2020, same thing. And finally, there's the case of Switzerland where it's really being legalized by omission, right? In Switzerland, it's not strictly speaking legal to offer assisted suicide. It is legal to help anyone commit suicide for any reason, as long as you're not doing so for selfish financial motives. So if somebody has an ingrown toenail and you help them to kill themselves, that's perfectly legal. The law originally was intended, I think, to help, to shield people who helped emotional teenagers who wanted to kill themselves because of, heartbreak, but has become but over the years has morphed into a assisted suicide industry as exemplified by Dignitas, right? The European Court of Human Rights, it is worth saying, has never pronounced itself on the legality or illegality of assisted suicide under the European Convention on Human Rights. Last year in Mortier v. Belgium, it it made some noises in that direction, but so far the position of the Strasbourg court, to which Ireland is subject to its jurisdiction, has been that this is a matter for national governments to decide. This, of course, could change, right? It tends to be the case that when something like that gains widespread European adoption, the ECTHR will eventually force it on all members of the Council of Europe. But so far, this hasn't happened yet. And efforts to make the court in Strasbourg declare euthanasia, assisted suicide, to be a human right under the European Convention have so far been unsuccessful so far. So that's some good news. The primary movers behind this are really a group of lobby groups, which are everywhere. They are highly effective. They are extremely well financed organizations. The money tends to come from, frankly, old ladies leaving the money in their wills. And they meet internationally. They coordinate the exchange experiences. They have paid for witnesses who testify in each other's countries about how this is great and how it works perfectly well in the Netherlands, in Canada, or in Australia. And they coordinate through the World Federation of Right to Die Societies, which was established in 1980. They currently have 60 members in 30 countries. In Ireland, the group is End of Life Ireland, which has this wonderful logo, which looks very peaceful with a little bird and so on, right? It's this aesthetic of death. It is worth saying that not all assisted suicide lobby groups are members of this federation. So, for instance, in England, Dying in Dignity, which is the most influential, the biggest, and the wealthiest of such groups, has chosen not to be a member of this federation because they want to present themselves as a moderate alternative to the more extreme English groups working in this area. So they have refused to join this. Which is to say that this federation and its members are too extreme, even for some of the activists in this area. But on the whole, they are extremely influential, and every year they have a big conference. They have activists, doctors, and people like that, and they meet, and then they exchange tips, and have been very effective in what they're doing, pushing for the cause worldwide. One of the reasons behind their recent success is that they have been able to rebrand themselves and to remove the yuck factor from their cause. So traditionally, what hampered assisted suicide euthanasia campaigners was the fact that they were frankly creeps. They were usually very eccentric people who, some of whom would be eugenicists, or people with very deranged sort of moral political philosophies, and they would be off-putting to more normal people, to more normal politicians. But in the past couple of decades or so, they have rebranded themselves into this very sort of respectable, centrist, presentable organizations. And that has been really at the core of their success, that they have been able to wash some of the stigma which has attached to their cause. Some of it historical, some of it coming from the fact that the activists are very peculiar people. So as an example, what used to be the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, which is the oldest such society in the world, established 90 years ago, rebranded itself as Dignity in Dying, quote unquote, in 2005. At the time, the move was very controversial. They lost actually most of the members and most of the income stream, the membership being dissatisfied with the more moderate positions they've taken. But the result of their shift to this moderate position has been that they have been able to push the legislature bill in England and Wales to a second reading, which is something they have never achieved before in 90 years of trying. They have been able to achieve this now. So clearly moving towards the center, so to speak, and hiring better publicists, hiring better advertisers has actually really helped the cause. This is no longer, in other words, a sort of a fringe cause. This is a mainstream, respectable movement. It's also worth saying that this is a very, very old project, right? As the VES, as we're discussing, was set up in 1935. They introduced the world's first modern euthanasia bill in 1936 in the British House of Lords, where it was defeated by a relatively good margin, but not by such a big margin as you would like to think would be the case in 1936. As I said, many of its early supporters were really creeps. They were eugenicists, by and large. Many of them were Nazi sympathizers. And the result of that was that after World War II, the movement came under grave disrepute as the atrocities from Nazi Germany and occupied Europe came to light, as the examples for, as the Nazi euthanasia program came to be known to the public much more widely. Euthanasia really became very disreputable. And for several decades afterward, the movement had difficulty getting traction among the respectable and went underground. So what they would do is that they would distribute kits or manuals telling people how to kill themselves. And sometimes doctors and nurses acting in the movement would secretly help to kill people in exchange for payment. So the movement really went underground for several decades. Because of the memories of World War II, but the memories of the war are fading, and the people no longer remember what happened some 80 years ago. So the moral stigma has lessened in recent decades. And this group have taken advantage of this, right? By and large, if you look across Western Europe, North America, and the West in general, these groups try to soften what they're proposing by really presenting assisted suicide and euthanasia as a sort of upper middle class lifestyle decision, right? It's very slick. It's very attractive people on the posters, to be very blunt. You know, very often very attractive, middle class women who are the faces of this movement. To the point where in Canada, actually, a clothing company has actually produced an advertising campaign featuring somebody who was chronically ill, who was going to kill herself and who did kill herself. So it's actually being commercialized to a great extent, as well. Dignitas, of course, was a pioneer in that, right? If you look at the Dignitas documentaries from over the years, it's very much somebody who's very well off, going to Switzerland, playing some, with classical music on, drinking the milkshake, and passing away peacefully. It's this image, it's this branding of euthanasia and assisted suicide as something which is not scary anymore, but something which is actually quite respectable and quite middle class, where, even though we know that this tends to disproportionately affect the poor, the disabled, and the vulnerable. They don't talk about this at all. So much for the context of where we are. We are at a very critical moment in the history of this issue. But so much of the history. I wanted to discuss now some of the key issues which have emerged from other countries, which I think might be helpful for an Irish audience. Now, forgive me if some of this stuff you know already, but I'm going to try to keep this at a sort of a broad, at a sort of a broad level of understanding, just to be sure. And if you know this already, I do apologize in advance. The first thing is really the slippery slope. The slippery slope, philosophers tell us, is a logical fallacy. Maybe, but it's also true. And the slippery slope exists in that almost every jurisdiction which has had assisted suicide or euthanasia legalized for a certain amount of time has expanded eligibility and or loosened the safeguards, almost always both at the same time. There are two exceptions which people always invoke, Switzerland and Luxembourg, where it is true that the laws have not changed. In Switzerland, it's because the law basically allows for anything, right? Any assistance to suicide for any reason, as long as it is not selfish, meaning financial, is legal. So really there's nothing to expand. And such examples, Luxembourg, which I think legalized assisted euthanasia in 2009. And the reasons they haven't expanded the law is that they adopted word for word, more or less, the Belgian law of that time, which already was extremely permissive, which allows for euthanasia for children and so on. And so Luxembourg, again, didn't really have anything more to expand it to. So apart from these two examples, every jurisdiction which has had it for a number of years has been expanding eligibility and loosening safeguards. This is a universal pattern. So the point is, there's no such thing as a restrictive assisted suicide or euthanasia law. It's always going to go toward expansion. So a good example is Canada, where I'm from. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada legalized assisted suicide for the terminally ill whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable, what is known as Track 1, MAID. MAID means medical assistance in dying. It's one of these many euphemisms which pervade the language of death, right? In Australia, it's VAD, voluntary assisted suicide. In England and Wales, it's assisted dying. In Canada, it's MAID, which sounds awfully comfortable, really. In 2021, Parliament expanded this in the middle of COVID, so there was no scrutiny, really. Parliament expanded this to anybody with a grievous and irremediable condition whose death was not reasonably foreseeable, which is known as Track 2 MAID. And that really covers a lot of people. Basically, anybody with a serious chronic condition with disability became eligible. If you're in a wheelchair, you are eligible. If you have really bad sciatica, you are eligible. So it's really anything goes, right? And at the same time, Parliament also legalized it for those who suffer from a grievous mental illness and only mental illness. This was supposed to come into force in 2023, but has been postponed twice already. Although there is a lawsuit pending by activists who argue that this is discrimination against the mentally ill to not allow for mental illness-based assisted suicide or euthanasia. So this might come sooner rather than later. And last October, the province of Quebec in Canada legalized euthanasia by advance directive, meaning that if you agree in advance and subsequently lose capacity, a doctor can kill you even if you don't know what's happening. Technically, under the laws of Canada, this is murder, but the province of Quebec basically said, we don't care, our people want it. And the government of Canada has announced that it will not enforce the law of murder in the province of Quebec in that regard, which is actually quite shocking, right? So all it took is a decade for Canada to get from a position where all of this was illegal to a position where murder literally is legal in the province of Quebec. So expansion can take place very, very quickly. The slippery slope is not so much a slope as it is a cliff edge. And it's probably just worth speaking about what's happening in England. So as you may know, in November, the Parliament of the United Kingdom voted in favor of giving a second reading to Kim Leadbeater's assisted suicide bill. And this bill is currently going through committee in Parliament. And what's been really fascinating is that even though this is not yet law, its proponents are already fast-tracking the slippery slope by removing safeguards. So just think about this. The law hasn't passed yet, and parliamentarians are already loosening the safeguards. So the slippery slope doesn't even need to wait for legalization to take place. And so recently they removed the requirement for a High Court judge to approve any request for assisted suicide, and things like that. So really, when change happens, it happens really, really fast. Why is this the case? Well, it's because proponents of assisted suicide euthanasia have framed what they're doing as proposing a right to die, a human right. And once you accept this idea that dying at a time of your choosing, using poison and other methods, once you accept that this is a human right, any limit on this right, quote unquote, becomes prima facie discrimination, right? So if you say only the terminally ill can have this right, the non-terminally ill can say, well, this is discrimination. If you say disabled people are not allowed to access this for disability alone, that constitutes disability-based discrimination, and so on. So once it becomes a matter of discrimination and of human rights law, it's actually very hard to defend any limits on assisted suicide euthanasia because it's generally speaking, hard to defend discrimination. And when you say, oh, it's human rights, that has a force in Western societies, which is very hard to rebut. And this is what happened in Canada, where provincial courts in Quebec held that to not allow the non-terminally ill to have euthanasia violates the human rights of the non-terminally ill, which again may sound perverse, but from a legal point of view, from a liberal human rights law point of view, it actually makes total sense, right? Because any limit has to be justified. Why do you have this limit? Why do you not want to allow the people to choose, right? So once we accept the language of choice, in a way, we have lost already. So much for the slippery slope. Safeguards. every time some salesman of death tries to sell this to a country, they will say, well, we have a really strong system of safeguards. The spoiler here is that safeguards do not work ever. Firstly, the people who are in charge of the institutions, the people who become experts in assisted suicide and euthanasia, by and large, are people who really believe in the cause and who want to do this work. So in most jurisdictions, most doctors and nurses refuse to have anything to do with it, which means that the doctors and nurses who are experts, who are involved with assisted suicide and euthanasia on a day-to-day basis tend to be enthusiasts for the cause, and they're the experts. They very often will be staffing the review boards and the committees which are tasked with making sure that this is working as intended. And the result is that actually they tend to do nothing to stem the worst abuses. The mechanisms for review tend to be very weak. In many jurisdictions, basically don't collect any data as to assisted suicide beyond the raw numbers. In Oregon, after a year, the files of the patients who have died by assisted suicide are destroyed, and there's no review because of patient confidentiality. So we don't actually know what's happening. In England, many people use Australia as an example of how you can do assisted suicide correctly. The reason is because Australia just doesn't keep very good data of what's happening, and we don't really know the abuses which happen in Australia. Because if you don't keep track, you don't know. Ignorance is bliss. The state and the medical regulators are very reluctant to prosecute the doctors and nurses who behave badly. Doctors are middle-class people. They are very sympathetic, they're articulate, and nobody really wants to send them to prison, which is why it takes a lot for a doctor to be even investigated for abusing the existing system. In Canada, there hasn't been a single criminal prosecution of a single person involved in going beyond the law in this area. For instance, in Belgium, there was a case of a doctor who killed his patient with a pillow when the drug didn't work. He was acquitted, and so on and so on. These horror stories happen all over the place. But doctors are very rarely, if ever, held accountable for going beyond what the law allows. So the safeguards actually just don't work. And of course, yesterday's safeguards are tomorrow's barriers to access, right? If it's a right, then any restriction is a barrier to access. So it's couched in the language of accessibility, right? And there's always a push to remove them, to make them more accessible, right? Because again, it's a right. And if it's a right, there should be sort of equal access. Makes sense if you accept the rights-based argument. So safeguards don't work. Some of you, I think, will be medical professionals, so it's probably just useful to mention that conscience rights also are harmed by this. Firstly, because in my experience, most of the public doesn't really think that doctors and medical professionals have such rights, right? In the jurisdictions where it's legal, the sense seems to be, it's legal, it's the law. You do it or you quit. So people don't actually necessarily think very highly of conscience rights. And the activists, by and large, don't view them as legitimate at all. In the English bill, there's no opt-out for medical professionals who want to have nothing to do with it. You don't have to do it yourself. You have to refer the patient to somebody who will do it. In the province of British Columbia in Canada, hospices, Catholic hospices usually, which have refused to allow euthanasia to take place on the grounds, have been defunded by the government. Because they refuse to do this. Because again, if it's a matter of rights, and if you don't allow this to happen on your grounds, then you're discriminating against the people who want to have access to this publicly funded service. And if you discriminate, well, the government can revoke your funding. So this has been happening, and this is pushed for by the lobbyists in favor of euthanasia. They really want every hospice, every hospital, every private home to be accessible to their reach, right? They don't want a death-free space to exist. And finally, and this is sort of more general, more nebulous point, society tends to be coarse and morally wherever it's legalized. And this comes from my experience. When the Canadian story of the abuses first broke, there was a huge wave of denial. People, would accuse me of disinformation, right? This is not happening. We are not offering that to people in wheelchairs. No, come on, that's ridiculous. Fast forward a couple of years, the same people will defend it, right? Because it takes a bit of time for them to rationalize what's happening. But once they have done so, they will defend things which they viewed with horror until yesterday. So really it makes societies which legalize it more morally coarse, rough. And if you talk to any Canadian, with elderly relatives in Canada, they will say, yes, my grandfather or my aunt has been offered maid because we're old. They would go into the ER and the doctor would say, you are 80 years old. Have you considered maid? And so on. It's part of the medical sort of intake culture now, right? Because it's legal. It's medical treatment according to law. So why not? Why shouldn't people be offered this on a regular basis? It's about choice. It's about personal autonomy, right? Suicide prevention. How do you have suicide prevention and assisted suicide in the same society? Some activists will say, actually, those are two very different things. Kit Matthouse, who is a British Conservative politician who's very much in favor of this, last week said something like, to many of us, suicide means when somebody healthy kills themselves, right? So he was trying to redefine suicide as to exclude euthanasia. Which is a perversion of the English language, but many of them really find very, very clever ways to justify why they oppose suicide in the broad sense, but they support assisted suicide, because according to them, assisted suicide is actually not about killing yourself. It's about, ending your life on your own terms. And you think, well, that's the same thing, but they will say, no, you can call it suicide. Kim Ledbetter, the English MP who's pushing for this, gets very offended if you call it suicide. She will check your language and tell you that you are being offensive, to people. And of course, things which nobody would imagine could ever happen in civilized society become normalized. A couple of years ago, the Mark Rutte government in the Netherlands offered its support for a proposal to allow old people to die if they feel that their life is complete. It's the sort of thing which you would read in dystopian novels, but in the Netherlands, after 20 years of having euthanasia being legalized, this is perfectly socially acceptable to the point where, so I work in the Netherlands, and if you speak out against this, people will accuse you of being against Dutch values, right? Because being able to kill yourself is now part and parcel of Dutch values. After 20 years of having it. So really, society is irrevocably changed by that. This is from Canada. 27% of respondents thought that you should be able to kill yourself because of poverty, 28% because you're homeless, 43% because you're mentally ill, 50% because you're disabled, and 51% because you cannot receive healthcare, the healthcare that you need. And to be fair, all of this except mental illness are already, legal. It is legal to kill yourself because you are in a wheelchair. It is legal to kill yourself if you have cancer and if you cannot get chemo in time. It is legal to kill yourself if you are poor, as long as you have a qualifying condition. All of this actually is more or less legal already. But society really, but the bounds of the permissive society really move very, very fast. And of course, there is the ugly side of money, right? The Parliamentary Budget Officer in Canada estimated that expanding eligibility to track 2 would save 86.9 million Canadian dollars per year, which in society which finds very hard to fund properly social and healthcare is actually a big chunk of money. Old people are expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Social care is really expensive. This is cheap. And so, to conclude, a couple of lessons. There's no equilibrium, right? Some people may be tempted to think, well, what if we had a really small, restrictive, limited law allowing for this, for the really sick people? The answer is, well, you can have that, but you won't keep it for a very long time. The slippery slope is real. Expansion is the default, and there's no equilibrium, which does not tend toward maximalism. That is really the most important lesson to be taken away from the international experience. There's no equilibrium which is restrictive. It always goes toward more and more permissiveness. The second one, safeguards, don't believe them. If people tell that safeguards are the strongest in the world, well, everybody says that. It's never true, and if it's true, it's not going to be true soon, and in 5 years' time. Safeguards will not save you. Regulators will not save you. The prosecutors will not save you. The police will not save you. Civil society, the press, nobody will save you, if you legalize this. And finally, this just makes societies, frankly, much worse morally in every way that you can imagine. So I think, the message to Ireland is this really has to be opposed tooth and nail, because once you open the door, you can never close it again. And there's no telling what will happen after that. Well, actually, there is telling, because we know from what's happening in Canada and Australia. And so please don't let Ireland follow the same path as these countries did. Thank you very much.